One of the reasons we have low voting at all in the Black community is because there's not a lot of confidence actually in the government and the idea that they're going to fix it. It's true that the Blacks who do vote tend to vote Democrat, but they also tend to be the most centrist Democrats. And in many big cities, they're extremely pro-business. Now,
we live in an era now where victimhood seems to be a race to see who can be the biggest victim. And we've heard a lot about white privilege. So I'm curious if the free market actually helps African Americans or if it victimizes them. So this professor is going to help me. Rachel Ferguson, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I'm happy to join.
Now, I'm not going to remember where the center you're with in Chicago, so help me out with that one.
Yes, Concordia University Chicago. I'm the director of the Free Enterprise Center.
How is there a free enterprise center anywhere in Chicago?
Basically due to the sheer willpower of our president, Russell Dawn, a wonderful man who's determined to have a liberty orientation at our university.
All right, so the book is Black Empowerment Through Free Enterprise.
Well, it's called Black Liberation Through the Marketplace.
I was so close.
But that's the idea, yes.
All right, let me start off with this and see where it goes. I'm hearing that there's systematic racism and that over the course of generations, African Americans have been so victimized that there's really no way for them to get to move ahead unless we do something to implement social justice, take away from here and pump up there. And that's the only way to do that. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, that's certainly the going wisdom at the moment. I think what I would say is it's really important to remember that, 80% of Black Americans aren't poor. They're majority middle class population, doing very well, living in the suburbs, progressing right along with American whites. And so who are we really worried about when we talk about issues of wealth inequality? And I would say we're worried about those who are really stuck economically, those who are maybe government dependent, maybe living in kind of ghettoized inner cities that are fairly isolated from the kinds of networks that help you to succeed. And I think when we look at those communities, we can look at a history of injustice there that certainly started with racism. It's not necessarily racism that's driving it now, though.
How is it not? Because that's what I've been told on every narrative I've seen, listened to, watched from Hollywood products. And it goes something like the institutional racism from generations have given white Americans such an incredible lead economically. And I think there's some truth to what the story is. But the idea is that white America was built on Black America's labor. And therefore, what white America owns, it owns unfairly.
Yeah, so we actually take this point that you just made, we take that on immediately at the beginning of the book.
Take it on for me right now. Isn't it true?
No, it's really not. And the way that I explain this is I basically defend Adam Smith's view. The idea is that
some other old dead white guy.
That's true. He was, but he was an abolitionist. He was an avid abolitionist, as was John Stuart Mill, the neoclassical economists, they were classical, but they were the forerunners of the neoclassical economists. And they were abolitionists not only for moral reasons, because the labor that one has in oneself is the most sacred and inviolable, as Adam Smith said, but also for economic reasons, right? The way to get rich is to get everyone into a position where they can benefit from exchange for mutual advantage. And that means that they can build their human capital, they can learn, they can move to where their labor is most wanted, they can invent things and get the benefits of selling them.
But if you don't have property rights, you cannot enjoy the fruits of your labor. It's not like those of us who promote free markets. It's not a difficult recipe for prosperity. You need property rights, you need low regulations, you need low taxation, and you need rule of law. And when you have those things, the recipe produces incredible wealth everywhere over time. It's just the way it is. But African Americans, Black America, for a long time didn't have, any of those.
Exactly.
They didn't have a right to own things. They didn't have a right to own their own labor. The most basic part of what you and I believe of a capitalistic society is you own your time, you own the fruits of your labor.
Yeah, and you can see the fruits of this in the Southern economy. So the Southern economy is often really overblown in the story we tell. There's even a famous book called The Half Has Never Been Told, where a person, the author claims that Ed Baptist claims that half of the American economy was the cotton economy. Yep. That's totally false. It was 5%.
Now, I've listened to this book. I didn't read it because I'm dyslexic, but I listened to this book, and the book told me that the economy, half the economy, is based on slave labor. Went into great detail about how production was pushed through torture and slave ownership, and made a very compelling case that Black America is why white America does so well today.
Right. And so the economists from whom Ed Baptist actually got the data that he used wrote a scathing book review saying that his book was fundamentally flawed because he actually made a math mistake. He was off by a factor of 10. It wasn't 50%, it was 5%. And that the improvements in cotton production had more to do with creating cotton that had larger bolls, BOLLS, right? Larger flowers. And that's what, it wasn't torture techniques that improved it, but rather just scientific techniques. And so what you see in the South is an economy that was large and wealthy relatively to the rest of the world, but was not nearly as wealthy as it could have been if it had been utilizing free labor like the North was. Southern planters weren't any wealthier than Northern industrialists, but they were a much smaller group. There were just a few families that were really in that position. And the rest of the South was very, very poor. You didn't have a strong middle class. You had a few rich people and a lot of poor people, which is exactly the opposite of what you expect to see in a free market economy, where you're going to have a whole lot of middle class people and a few poor and a few rich.
I've heard there were also Black slave owners. I know this is a tiny portion, but the point being that some slave owners were not white at all. I don't know if you've touched on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, there were Black and Native American slave owners. I'm not exactly sure to the extent to which Black slave owners were actually just nominally owning members of their own family who they were trying to free, but weren't legally allowed to free. So one of the stories that often gets lost is that people weren't even able to free their slaves sometimes because the state laws forbade it. They didn't want a lot of free Blacks running around.
Even if his econometrics were off, even if the cotton economy was 5% of the economy, which sounds much more likely given the industrialization that was taking hold in the North, that's still a moral wrong. And that there was a moral wrong. And then after that moral wrong was another moral wrong in Jim Crow. We saw things like Black entrepreneurs in Oklahoma City who had their towns literally burnt to the ground. So they were doing exactly what you and I say is the way to get ahead, which is to build, to own, to create wealth. They did so, and they lost it all. So there's still history of Black America not being able to have that American dream. Fair?
That's fair. And the story we need to tell as classical liberals, conservatives, libertarians, the story we need to tell is that these things happened because of the violations of the basic principles of liberalism. As you said, private property, freedom of contract, and equal protection of the rule of law. And also culturally, right? Culturally, you can't really indulge envy in a commercial society because you have to understand that others who do well are benefiting you too. Right? When I win, you win. That's the idea of a free market. But what you saw in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was the white part of town benefiting immensely from the Black part of town, but just being too envious. In other words, wanting that status good of being above the Black population.
So
and because they weren't above them, they murdered them.
Seems to line up against this idea that, well, here we are, 2022, and it's still unfair because of those sins of the past. And economically, we're starting off at different starting points, and therefore social justice, another word for socialism, we need to take from those and give to those whose families didn't have. That's the only way to fix this, right?
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of responses to this. I mean, one is the great enrichment that you've already mentioned, right? You can see people move, like say in South Korea, from literally picking rice to running the Kia dealership in 2 generations. I mean, a lot can change very quickly when you're talking about a market economy. And so I believe that that can happen for Black America as well. But you also have to look at unintended consequences. It may be true that people need to catch up. Maybe we need another couple of generations for people to catch up. But the idea that intervening will make things better assumes that we'll get the consequences we want out of the policies that we choose. And so just to pick something out of a hat, let's take affirmative action. Affirmative action sounds right. We want to get people into jobs that they deserve. And initially, right after the end of Jim Crow, you could really see the logic of it because people were barred from certain kinds of positions. But since then, what you've seen is something really destructive. The mismatch of students, for instance, with the college that they can thrive the most in. And what that does is instead of giving us more Black lawyers and Black doctors, it pulls perfectly good students out of the University of Michigan, sends them to MIT, where they fail because they do have a tougher background. They don't have necessarily all of the extra kinds of educational things that their white compatriots had. And so they fail where they would have succeeded if they'd simply stayed at University of Michigan. That creates fewer Black doctors, fewer Black lawyers, and actually takes us longer to get over the racial hangover that we're dealing with in the United States.
All right, so you mentioned a couple things that spark interest in me. In that, one of my favorite statistics is that overwhelmingly the number of first-generation millionaires in America are immigrants.
Yeah.
This blows my mind in that people come here, they don't know the language, they don't know the laws, they don't have the connections, they don't understand the culture. And through hard work and the opportunities that they see, but those of us who are born here are blind to, within a generation become millionaires. And I know, and you know where I'm going to go with this. So yeah. let's.
I'm ready.
Other races have been able to embrace this. Why so many Asian families seem to embrace this idea of, I'll use your term, liberation through the marketplace, and have built these things, while statistically speaking, African American families have not done the same. One of my favorite, and it says so much, this idea that we have systematic racism, that if you're born Black, you don't have those same opportunities because of systematic racism in America. Well, the immigrants coming here and doing this blows that away, including Black immigrants from the Ivory Coast and others who
Nigeria.
In the course of one generation have also had financial success and become middle class. And they've done this even though they're Black. So it tells me that maybe it's not the color of your skin, and maybe this idea of systematic racism is overblown. You tell me.
Yeah, I think it's a mix because you just have to tell a more nuanced historical story. And so if you go back to a period in which you have sort of de jure racist system, which you did have under Jim Crow, it's interesting. I mean, from 1940 to 1964, the poverty rate in the American community went from 89%, the African American community went from 89% to 41%. It was literally halved during the period prior to the civil rights movement, right? Or the success of the civil rights movement's goals. And so that's very counterintuitive. And then if you move on, what you see is that there was a lot of progressive social engineering that was done through not only redlining, but also the building of the federal highway system, urban renewal, and of course, the Great Society. And we see that all of these things got to the very thick civil society institutions upon which or through which individuals can really thrive. And so you see these immigrant communities doing so well because they have extremely strong families and oftentimes very strong communities, maybe churches or temples that they're involved in. And so they are deeply supported in their efforts. And alternatively, you see Black economic centers that have been built up, neighborhoods that are blooming, private schools that are being done through the Black church, all being blown to bits by the building of the highway systems in every major city in America, being blown to bits by slum clearance, what James Baldwin called Negro removal that happened in every major city in America. If you mow down the economic center that is where all of those civil society institutions are thriving, and then you scatter them to the four winds and you ask people to reconstitute them elsewhere, that's going to be really, really difficult.
Help me understand that a little bit more. As somebody who looks at highways and physical mobility being a key to economic mobility, when I see the greatest driver of economic advancement in my mind was the automobile being able to be afforded by average Americans. And now people could live where it was least affordable or where they wish to live and go to where it's most profitable to work. Didn't those highways help expand Black advancement?
Not really. So what you see is that there's a lot to say here, but one is with the GI Bill, you had the building of suburban communities that only whites were allowed to live in many cases. And so they could take advantage of the GI Bill, but Black Americans, even ones who did fight in the war, often could not. And so they could not move out to those suburbs where they had cheaper housing. As a matter of fact, Blacks consistently had higher housing costs than whites relative to their situation because they were limited in the places they were allowed to live, right? So low supply, high price. And so because they're stuck in the cities and not able to move out to the suburbs, they don't actually really benefit from those highways. It doesn't help them at all. Furthermore, when the municipal leaders were given the millions of dollars to put the highways in where they wanted to, they did it in a very racist way. And they did it with specific social engineering goals in mind. They wanted to put white people on one side of the highway and everybody else on the other side. And that's exactly what they did. And so when you have a big concrete wall between yourself and the other people you're trying to exchange with, it really slows you down economically. So I think it ended up actually being harmful.
Aren't you just giving more explanations as to why we need more social justice? You keep saying we need liberation through the marketplace, but you keep telling me this history of why African Americans were wronged and then wronged and then wronged. And now, so there has to be some sort of correction. And I'll ask you about, we'll work in the reparations question here in a second, one of my favorites. But
okay.
So therefore, what we need to do, and I keep telling you this, Rachel, we need to take from other people by force and give to these people so that we even this out, because you keep listing out these wrongs.
Yeah, but the story I'm trying to tell is that the racist intent is at the beginning of the story. But that's the non-proximate cause. It's not the proximate cause. It's not the one that's closest to the problems we're having today. It's the beginning of the snowball effect, one might say. But what happens? You end up undermining family structure, undermining community, isolating people in the inner cities, et cetera. And so what you get are a totally different set of problems, right? What you get are parents who really need mentors, right? To learn how to parent. You lose your employment networks, which means you need to be tied to employment networks. You lose your love for education, et cetera. And so there's all of these really deep
sure sounds
human...
to me like you're dishing on African-American culture.
I am talking about a specific group of African-Americans in the inner city who are struggling with poverty. I think that a minority of this group makes up the sort of stereotype, the criminal type. That's not a majority of the people in that situation. Most of the majority are victims of that crime. But it is true that things like family structure have been totally undermined in those communities. And that's just undeniable. I mean, we're looking at communities where sometimes no one is married.
Isn't this when you get called a racist?
Not by regular Black people. So I think we need to remember that the really popular sort of far left narrative that we hear out of academia, whether it's coming from Black or white people, isn't particularly representative of normal Black people. For instance, think of the role of the Black church in Black America. This is huge. It's the cultural womb of Black America. A lot of Black Americans are extremely socially conservative. They're very pro-family. A lot of these problems are things that they hate and want to fix. And they know full well that those are issues. They may not like being beat up by them, by conservatives. Maybe it would, rather than being beat up with them, maybe we could use some help, right? We could use some mentors for dads or mentors for kids or rides for kids to go see their dad in jail. The sorts of things that could actually build people up again and restore what's been lost.
Let me dive right into the dependency state. This scares me more than anything else. So I look at the progressive left and the idea of whether it's universal basic income, we're going to redistribute money here, reparations for past sins from past generations, whatever it is, all of it is a lifestyle of dependency. And I look at the current left and I can't help but come to a conclusion that you hate poor people. You hate poor people because you keep them in schools that are failing and you don't give them educational choice to use that money and go to perhaps even a private school like the rich white guy on the other side of the highway. We give you a bus pass and we make owning a car so remarkably unaffordable, but without a car, unless you live in New York City or some very dense area, you are a second-class citizen. Without an automobile, you will forever be on the bottom rung of the economic ladder. But instead, the left hands out bus passes and builds trains instead of roads and puts in things like cash for clunkers and environmental standards, which makes cars now ridiculously expensive. We now have such incredible growth control. Growth control like urban growth boundaries and smart planning, which does nothing but to make homes more expensive. My home state of Colorado, 98% of the state is undeveloped. But you're not allowed to put affordable homes out there because we pack and stack people. And the people who cannot buy a house are largely minorities who are poor. Those of us who are able to buy a house, because of this forced scarcity, our wealth goes up. Our property values go up on the backs of people who can't do it. All these are progressive policies that do nothing but keep poor people poor, yet those poor people seem to always vote for the socialist-leaning politicians that give them more of the same. Help me.
I agree with your analysis totally. I could add to it. Our banking regulations, for instance, are now making it it's extremely unlikely that you can even get a small home loan. And so, small-time home buyers are kind of out of luck. We could go on and on and on with the failure of these progressive policies because progressives are addicted to central planning. They just really believe that this is the solution, and they don't really grasp the beauty of spontaneous order, of emergent order, of the beauty of decentralized solutions in which people figure things out for themselves in a local sort of way. So I totally agree with you on that. I would say that, one of the reasons we have low voting at all in the Black community is because there's not a lot of confidence actually in the government and the idea that they're going to fix it. It's true that the Blacks who do vote tend to vote Democrat, but they also tend to be the most centrist Democrats. And in many big cities, they're extremely pro-business. Now, I don't know if they're as pro-market as we might like. They're often
the idea of crony and business and what you and I consider capitalism and freedom are two different things that the media and Hollywood love to combine as one. But,
they're two different things, but they're not trying to dismantle the capitalist marketplace.
Black voters vote as a bloc for Democrats.
That's right.
Overwhelmingly. By the way, it only takes a few, and I think Donald Trump proved this. It doesn't take that many. He brought in more black voters than any Republican, and it doesn't take that many to switch the scales for victory. When Obama ran, black voters came out because they wanted to see the first black president, and too bad the black president did more to hurt them with things like cash for clunkers and more centralized planning, which hurts them. Why is it that we've had a hard time messaging, which is these people who are giving you stuff are enslaving you into a bad system that keeps you at the bottom of the economic ladder?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think I really do blame conservatives. I think this is on them. Everyone's complaining about the fact that the left is telling the story of American history right now, but conservatives didn't tell the story. They didn't tell the story of Black people in America. They didn't tell the story that I'm telling in the book. That's the purpose of my book, is to admit that so many of these forms of oppression were actually just violations of property rights, economic freedoms, contract rights, and the rule of law. That's the story we should have been telling all along. That's the story that Rose Wilder Lane told at the Pittsburgh Courier as the great pro-Black libertarian. That's the story that two of the founders of the NAACP, who were great classical liberals, were telling, but there weren't enough voices telling that story. And now the left is sucking all the air out of the room. And that means that Black people simply don't associate the conservative party in many cases with their own interests, even though in many cases, I think they should.
If they did, and they said, all right, we agree, what would they be demanding right now? In order to, as you put it, Black liberation through the marketplace, what would liberate Black America now? Be precise.
Okay, so we talk about 5 solutions in the book. One is economic freedom, which we've already discussed, things like occupational licensing reform. One is educational freedom, so that's going to be your school choice. This is very popular among Black families and even more popular among Latino families, by the way. 60 to 70% are pro some form of school choice. We talk about criminal justice reform. We think too many things are criminalized. And there's also just some kind of boring bureaucratic things that need to change in prosecutors' offices. And then we talk about neighborhood stabilization, which is what I mentioned a few minutes ago. We really need to do philanthropy differently. We do
help me. It sounds like a buzzword to me. Neighborhood stabilization. Sounds like something a progressive would come up with. Help me out here, Rachel.
I kind of made the word up, but what I did is I put together all of the thinkers who are talking about what we might call toxic charity. Or the book When Helping Hurts is kind of a famous one.
What is toxic charity?
Toxic charity is when we set up our philanthropy in such a way as to encourage dependency in the exact same way that the government does, right? It's faceless, it's food pantries, it's handouts, it's undignifying. And it's not transformative. We're not seeing people actually emerge from poverty. We're just getting them through till next Tuesday. It's the same, whether it's the state or private charity doing it. And so what I'm challenging private, conservative, and libertarian citizens to do is to reconsider their philanthropic model and think about models that are deeply dignifying. But those are more work. You have to really walk through life with people. It's a holistic approach, because people who are living in destabilized neighborhoods, like the ones in our inner cities, don't have one problem, they have 10. Right. And so if we're going to help them, we're going to have to really help them in a lot of different ways. And so this is going to take real love, personal presence, hyper local, block by block sort of work. But guess what? It's being done all over the country. Robert Lupton in Atlanta with Focused Community Strategies, Bob Woodson, who I'm sure you're aware of. It does this sort of thing. John Perkins with the Christian Community Development Association, and Brian Fickert at the Chalmers Center will help your whole church turn flip their philanthropic model upside down and do it the right way. But if we're going to tout these critiques of the welfare state, we better not be doing charity in the exact same way, or we're not credible, are we?
Let's talk real briefly about reparations, because just like rent control, it pops up every few years.
Yeah.
And here we go. And what I've heard from even Black friends of mine saying, if we really did get our 40 acres and a mule, if we actually got that, then we'd have, I wouldn't say parity, but then we'd be fine now. We would have a piece of the rock now. And I get that. Of course, there was never any legislation for 40 acres and a mule. But the idea is that we bring that forward, and descendants of white people or need to give descendants of Black people this huge cash transfer. And once this transfer is over, the problem is solved. No more white guilt, no more white privilege, no more handouts, no more of this toxic charity you're talking about. The problem will be solved by poor Hispanic people writing a check to Michael Jordan, and it'll be taken care of.
Yeah, so my position on reparations goes like this. I don't think that reparations make any sense past a human lifetime. But we can see real justice claims, like in the case of the Japanese internment camps, right? You had people who did receive reparations in the 1980s for the confiscation of their land. And that made sense. That was a justice claim. It wasn't a redistributive claim. It was a justice claim.
By just a quick side note, let's also celebrate the great social engineer FDR, who put forward that remarkably racist, awful plan to take people's property and put them into basically encampments, concentration camps, whatever you want to call them. The same guy who decided that you and I can't own gold and would wake up every morning and set the price of gold during his reign as well, because central engineering comes up with solutions like that.
Yeah, and FDR was very cavalier about civil liberties, and you have great thinkers like Zora Neale Hurston, for instance, who was very anti-New Deal. So that's interesting. But my point is that if we talk about reparations, we're not talking about slavery, we're talking about Jim Crow. We're talking about something within living memory. If we're talking about it at all, it's a justice claim. And we can't take it from white people or poor Latino people because actually they didn't benefit. I mean, that's the confusion, right? The confusion is that people benefited off of the economic exclusion of Black people, but they didn't benefit. They lost. You might have a few people here or there, like maybe a member of a union who gets a higher wage, benefited. But most white Americans just lost. They lost out on the things they could have exchanged with their fellow Americans. And they were poorer as a result, not richer.
Stop there. That's a bit of a mind blower.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that Jim Crow obviously hurt African Americans. You're telling me it hurt white America.
Absolutely. Because
convince us of this, Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, really, I'm just thinking logically. Anytime you exclude one part of the population from their ability to flourish economically, you lose everything you could have exchanged with them, right? And so the harder it is for them to learn, the harder it is for them to move up, the harder it is for them to get their inventions out there, et cetera, then the more you lose out on everything they had to offer. And I think that's exactly what happened to white America in general. We were poorer as a result of those exclusions rather than richer. And so if that's the case, we can't do reparations based on redistribution. That would not be just. But look at some of the injustices that I mentioned: the highway system, the urban renewal, the redlining, the Great Society efforts. Those were all done by the federal government. They weren't just done by you and me or our grandparents. They were done by the federal government. And so the federal government is the entity which owes reparations if they are owed, which means that reparations would have to come out of the federal government's assets, such as part of its $2 trillion worth of land.
So much of that is laughable. Let me just grab a couple of these. I love the point you're making, that the wrong was not done by white America, it was done by central planned government, the federal government, at which point they're the ones that need to create reparations. You also mentioned $2 trillion worth of land assets that could be used. That is a hard asset. I'm sorry, didn't we just create $2 trillion, maybe more, out of thin air that we have now redistributed to everyone? So at what point does a cynic like me go, wait a second, we paid for the Great Society, we paid for welfare, we've paid for housing, we're paying now for Obamacare, we're paying for free lunches, we are paying, basically, we have a universal basic income. Instead of one check, it's just a bunch of checks from your federal welfare, your local welfare, your rent, this, that, and the other thing. But people are making money. And there has been a massive transfer, largely to minorities, largely to Black Americans. Isn't that reparations?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly John McWhorter's argument, right? He says, we've done it already. And I guess what I would say is the only problem with that is that we did it in such a way as to breed dependency, right? We did it in an incredibly dysfunctional way. And so what we did is we actually made the situation worse rather than better by creating incredibly perverse incentives. We don't have welfare traps. We have welfare deserts.
How do you mean? Explain that.
The idea, we talk about the welfare cliff, like maybe if I make 5 cents more, it doesn't do me any good because I lose a benefit. But it's actually something like a 95% marginal tax rate. I mean, there is a total and complete disincentive to work if you are receiving benefits because you will lose them and your life will be much harder, but for no gain. And
so in
we've
other words,
set it up.
it's not like if I take this promotion, I'm going to lose a little bit of money in taking this promotion because I'm going to lose this benefit. But in a year, I'm going to be on my merry way and it'll be worth it. You're telling me that if I take this promotion, I lose my food stamps, I lose my welfare, I might lose my Section 8 housing, I might lose all these other welfare programs. So instead of just losing a little, I take this one promotion, I drop off a flippin' cliff.
Yeah.
And so I'm never going to do that. So I'm in a trap.
And you can be getting as much as $60,000 in welfare benefits per year. I know, it's wild. So what does that mean? That means if you move up from a job that pays $25,000 to a job that pays $27,000, what in the world would be the reason to do that? There would be no reason. And so you're
I'm sorry, it's blowing my mind.
It's possible.
That when you add it all up, you could be getting a wealth transfer of $60,000. Why would anyone ever work if you could be given $60,000 a year? So
exactly.
So is it?
So that's.
Is it? So I see both a cultural issue and I also see the financial trap.
It's economically irrational. If it was you or I, we would do the same exact thing. I mean, it would just be totally economically irrational to try and put my kids in daycare and do all this hard work for somebody that I, don't love to work for or whatever it is to gain nothing. It makes no sense. No one would do it. And so it's deeply perverse. And so what I'm talking about, assuming this would ever be politically viable, which it probably isn't, but if reparations that involve the sale of federal assets were possible, they would be put in the direction of empowering the entrepreneurs. What we want to do, and I'll leave it to the economists to tell me the best way to do that, but what we want to do is empower the business community.
That is, all right, you've said a lot of smart things. That is the stupidest thing you have said in this conversation.
I should say the free market economists. No. I'll leave it to the free market economists. We can talk about whether that's financial planning, whether that's low interest loans. There are certain critiques that I've heard of the idea of using loans. So I'm happy to talk about that. But the point is that you want to build wealth. And the truth is we're still in separate social networks, which means that Black employers will hire more Black employees. And so the more we can support Black employers, the more we are lifting up the entire Black community. And we're building Black wealth, which is really the only big gap that's left right now, is the wealth gap.
Am I hearing an echo of separate but equal?
No, because what I decided to do in the section that I wrote on reparations is to say, the truth is that while we have a real justice claim coming from the Black community that they can make, and really from the Native American community too, which we've really undermined economically with the perverse incentives, we also have a genuine claim from poor whites. Look at the South. Whites had to run the slave patrols. That was like slavery itself. I'm not saying it was as bad as that, but they were being forced to do it, and their wages were bid down by having to compete with slavery. The Southern economy was somewhat ruined. The infrastructure was very undeveloped because of slavery. And so poor white Southerners, for instance, suffered terribly as a result of all of that. And so what I would suggest is making this money available to entrepreneurs that are means tested, that are anywhere below a certain level of poverty, but also making it available to all Black or Native Americans as well, just because they have a real justice claim based on the violations of progressive policy through the federal government.
I think what you just said is a pipe dream.
It probably is.
I have a hard time seeing the federal Congress say, you know what, we're going to sell off our public lands and somehow figure out a way to give it only to entrepreneurs who are in poverty now. I don't see that. What I do see is a potential cultural awakening inside minority communities and all poverty communities, that these systems that have been there to help you have not just hurt you, they have enslaved you. You are now in a cycle that you're going to teach your kids dependency is the way, dependency is the way, dependency is the way, and it's only going to get worse and worse. And it shows me that if that Black man from the Ivory Coast can come to America, not speak the language, and still become a millionaire in one lifetime, there is nothing that Black American who understands our culture can't do. I mean, it's proven it can be done. Let me leave it with this, with a couple personal questions. You don't strike me as a black woman yourself. What's your interest? Why do you care about this? And who are you to be lecturing Black Americans on the liberation of the marketplace?
Well, I'm a classical liberal political philosopher, so it's my job to think about the way that classical liberalism applies.
That and a pizza will get you a pizza. Yeah.
It's my job to think about these issues, but actually what happened is Ferguson. We had the unrest in Ferguson. I was already working on criminal justice reform like a good classical liberal professor, started getting involved in supporting the entrepreneurs there. And over time, as the Black students at my university at the time wanted to visit, for instance, the opening of the Black American Museum in Washington, D.C. and projects like that, I became involved in supporting those things. And what I said to my colleagues is, listen, if you want me to be involved in this, I need to be talking to these students about the classical liberal account of the oppression of African Americans. They need to understand what really happened, how much is due to progressive central planning and, frankly, eugenicist racism, including things like the minimum wage. They need to hear this account. And as I started putting that account together for my students, it turned into a book. And so that's sort of how the process happened. But I've always been concerned, particularly about the Black American male. And that's because I grew up in a household with two inner city foster brothers. I watched them struggle through the criminal justice system. And I looked around and I thought, well, the welfare state isn't doing it. That's not what's fixing it, right? And so in my mind, all through my career as a political philosopher, I've had that group in the back of my mind. What are we going to do for this quote unquote, least well-off group in the United States? And this is my answer. This book is my answer to that nagging question that's hounded me through my whole career.
All right, let's give that plug for that book. Hold it up, make it proud.
Black Liberation Through the Marketplace. It's available on Amazon for just $18.
Just $18?
And I made it as cheap as I could, and I wrote it for a popular audience. And so it's very readable, I hope. And I wrote it with a historian, so it's not just a philosopher talking. I've got help with the history. And you can also talk to me on Twitter at Liberty Ethics, which is my handle there, or Facebook or LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you.
Liberty Ethics. And are you open to debate other people from the social justice side of this? Have you done any of those? And would you be willing to?
I would certainly be happy. I haven't really done a debate. I don't know if I'm good at debate or not, but I'd certainly be willing to give it a try.
That sounds fun. Rachel, this has been incredible. Thank you for doing it, and thanks for putting out the book.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.